Hey guys, this is my first attempt at making a video specifically about trauma. You may remember a video I did, I think it was a week, 2 weeks ago, where I talked a little bit about it by complete accident, and it seemed to work. It seemed to help a lot of people, and so we're gonna do Trauma Tuesdays intermittently with Tatas Tuesdays, because eventually you guys are gonna get a bit sick of talking about tatas. Who can do that? Some people are ass men. But, you know, I wanted to sort of temper it out with the lady bits because I cannot talk about women's issues every single day, right? I have diverse and myriad tastes, like video games, and that's why I'm playing RimWorld for you guys, because people also said, do some gameplay, do some RimWorld gameplay, and I love RimWorld. I think it's one of the most relaxing games out there. But it's also sort of relevant to this topic because everything will be going along hunky-dory, but you've got this thing where they crash landed a planet and they're struggling for survival, and then everything will be going super, super awesome. You're building it up, everything's good, and then stuff goes horribly wrong. And so many RimWorld colonists probably have some form of PTSD, and with the trauma triggers that come with it. And in RimWorld, the colonists do snap and go on these drug binges and overeating, or they wander around in sadness, or they have psychotic breaks. It's actually a very good game for this topic. So I wanted to talk about what trauma triggers are and what they're not. A trauma trigger, to put simply, which is a harder thing to do than you think it is some sort of traumatic memory or flashback. It's not just an uncomfortable feeling. The thing that a lot of people get wrong when they try to depict a trauma trigger, and we're going to go back to this theme over and over and over again during this segment, is that trauma triggers are not just mental and emotional, they're physical. Sometimes and that is, at least for me, the thing I had the hardest time identifying. I was ready for racing thoughts. I was ready for the bad memories. What it took me a lot longer to catch was when it started as physical symptoms without any sort of attached cognitive anything. There was no memory. There was no flashback. The body was remembering even though the brain wasn't, and that is a bizarre element of PTSD that I'm not even going to get into reasons why, because they seem so dumb and pseudoscience. I'm just going to attest that from my own personal experience they do happen, and those for me were the hardest ones to sort of identify and, you know, boss fight, because I did not expect that to be a thing until a counselor said the body remembers trauma. Interesting thing, huh? I think it's interesting anyway. Because what that means is somebody can be the most emotionally resilient, strong person with the greatest coping skills on the planet, and they still can have physical negative impacts from trauma that need to be addressed, because after a certain point, they don't go away on their own. If you have been through a traumatic event and 2 or 3 months later, you are still feeling bad somehow, and not just emotionally bad, like physically sick, that needs to be addressed. It is not going to go away on its own, and it may even deteriorate. So a trigger, it can be anything, and that's why trigger warnings in schools are so controversial. Simply discussing the event, whether it be simple assault, I hate that term, sexual assault, bullying, you know, domestic abuse, child abuse, anything like that. Just saying the word doesn't necessarily make someone have a flashback. Why? Because they've probably confronted that word a lot. They've had to hear it, especially if the police were involved, especially if, you know, they had to testify or anything like that. They have created a resiliency. They have had a form of exposure therapy. And so you can say child abuse around a survivor of child abuse and won't trigger them. They won't all of a sudden be somewhere else in their brains or their bodies. Triggers are sensual, not in the way you normally hear, but sight, sound, smell, taste. Smell and sound were big ones for me. I guess convenient thing for me, I didn't have that many sight triggers because the physical things were so common that I had a period where, you know, I don't want to see it, I don't want to see it. There's no way to get away from the stuff that would have triggered me in that way. But sound and smell were really profound ones. The smell of beer for the longest time. The nice thing about smell is that internet trolls can't trigger you with those. So I can talk about that in, you know, relative. I don't have to worry about somebody going beer, you know. But sounds were definitely a thing. Tones of voice, certain turns of phrase that unfortunately happened in one game trailer at E3 one year and resulted in some tweets that I will never be able to live down. And that's the thing about triggers, is that they do not look the way you see on TV. It drives me crazy. It ruined my enjoyment of the Netflix series Jessica Jones, because at least in my case, when I was triggered, I didn't turn into a weeping ball, you know, hiding in a closet or something like that. I was outwardly functional. I just wasn't necessarily responding entirely to what was actually going on in the present. You have to keep in mind that many trauma survivors, especially ex-military and first responders, are extremely brave, extremely resilient people. And what happens in a lot of cases is they pack down so much. They self-medicate with booze and drugs. They, you know, do self-therapy with exercise and things like that. They're good at coping. And so they mask the instance of a trigger extremely well. I was pretty guilty of that myself until things got really, really, really bad. And that's what happens. You hide it so well, people don't know what's going on with you. They just think you're an asshole. You know, that Kratos metaphor I talked about where, you know, he's fighting through his trauma and taking down everybody else with him. And so I wish that they would actually start depicting things in a more realistic way. The other thing about Jessica Jones that really bugged me is the big climactic thing. This isn't a huge spoiler, but it kind of is. That trauma doesn't just disappear at a convenient plot moment. It is there and you have to deal with it. And, you know, getting revenge or overcoming a temporary instance does not allow you to deal with how you got to that point. So even if you overcome one part of your trauma, there's a lot more work to do because it's usually a lifetime of buildup until one specific event knocks down the house of cards that was kind of built up. That whole thing in Jessica Jones where she's repeating the street names is a technique to slow down runaway thoughts. Now, I don't know why they decided to pick that. It was a convenient dramatic device, but remembering your childhood street does not bring you back to the present. And that's what drove me crazy about the way they depicted PTSD in Jessica Jones, that, you know, going back to the past, using street names from where you grew up is actually exacerbating that feeling of displacement, kind of half being in the past, half being in the present. The idea of slowing down those thoughts is, I am here, this is not happening, I am, you know, in my living room with you know, Better Call Saul deals with it in a better way. If you've seen the exercise that the therapist gives Chuck, Saul's brother, he has to identify the color of various objects. So like, you know, red lantern, black kettle, blue wall. That is grounding him in the present. That is much, 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 much more effective than going back to something in the past, especially a period in the past that connected to the trauma you're trying to treat. Can you tell I'm driven crazy by Jessica Jones? Yes, yes I am. Moving on. The other interesting thing about getting through your trauma triggers, about working through them, is that triggers can evolve. You deal with the most obvious ones first, and they are the most severe. The interesting thing is, though, the ones that are the most severe are not necessarily the ones that are doing you the most damage. They're the ones that you're aware of because they're mental, they are emotional. And a lot of us have gotten very, very, very good at identifying emotional stuff when you've had a ton of therapy. What is more difficult is those body ones that have nothing to do with thoughts, and they can be linked to environment. They can be linked to time of day. And those are tricky because they sneak up on you. Backstab damage is 4 times. We all know that from Dungeons and Dragons. That's what happens with these bodily triggers. So what ends up happening, and this is what gets so frustrating with the whole journey out of PTSD. God of War 1 is the simple shit, right? He shows up, he kills Ares. Ares is the one that screwed him over and, you know, caused him to kill his family. So he has had that revenge. The Ares trigger is done, right? Game over, we win. But there's multiple more games, right? And I actually think it's so interesting because, again, designer of God of War, you know, Jaffe told me absolutely not in their minds, but it fits so well. So I am not saying that they intended to make God of War a metaphor for PTSD, but it works super, super well. Because then you got God of War 2, where then you start finding, oh, gee, these things I used to defeat my primary triggers, well, guess what? Now they're harming me. And that can be alcohol. That can be avoidant behavior. That can be, and that's where those situations you've been avoiding, you have to address them now. And of course, in God of War 2, it was, you know, Kratos realized he's being used and he slays through all of those. And I don't even remember. I think it sort of ended, God of War 2 just kind of ended, and they're climbing up that wall to Mount Olympus. So it's sort of a work in progress. And he sort of laid the groundwork, cuts away a lot of those sort of secondary things like substance abuse, like, all that stuff. And it's hard to address that stuff until you address the Ares triggers, the God of War 1 triggers, because you're self-medicating. So the next step is to get rid of the self-medication, or at least diminish it to the point that it's not affecting your health anymore. Personally, I think one of the most effective self-medications is video games because it doesn't destroy your liver. You can sit here and have a great old time playing games. They're relaxing. They keep you grounded in the present because you have to focus on the game. It's really, really good. And it doesn't matter what the game is as long as it's engaging enough to keep you focused. But then you get to God of War 3. Big kahuna. Big climax, right? And that's when you have to address the root shit, or what you think is the root shit. And this is when you start getting into not even the body traumas yet. You're addressing those right back to the well. Oh, he kills Zeus in the second one or something like that. I don't know. No. Zeus is the last fight. So yeah, it's Zeus, but then you have to deal with Athena. And that's when you start getting sort of this corollary stuff where it's like, okay, you're addressing the secondary stuff, but then there's all this tertiary stuff where Zeus was linked to Ares, but then Athena was sort of warping the whole thing. And you got to deal with that. And that is painful stuff because you end up having to cut away things that temporarily made you feel good. It's really hard, and if it sounds like you don't have much left and you're kind of a broken and bleeding wreck, well, that's the way God of War 3 ended, wasn't it? He didn't walk off triumphant. He crawled away. And then the God of War metaphor gets even more interesting because what's the last console game? I mean, PSP games aside, where we sort of explore the roots of the trauma a little bit more. God of War Ascension goes way, way, way back. before the initial Ares trauma, Ares boss fight. And that's where the body trauma comes in, right? That the whole, you know, him climbing out of hell and all that stuff, you really have to sit with yourself and you really have to figure out how you got to that place and address the things that you did and you had to do, and those moments where you are on guard without even realizing you're at. And like God of War Ascension, that's the hardest of the games, and a lot of people don't complete it because, my God, you're tired. The other games were so much more rewarding and it was part of the main story, and this other shit, I don't care anymore. What's with this multiplayer? Why is there bugs coming out of this chick's boobs? It just feels a lot less satisfying, and it's harder on top of it. But if you really want to be functional, you gotta beat that game. You know, you could probably use a similar metaphor for Dark Souls. I'd have to think about that a little bit. But, you know, Dark Souls, Silent Hill, all those kind of grindy horror games are very, very much about trauma. And if you think about trauma through Silent Hill, the nurses are a trigger. Pyramid Head is a trigger. If you want to understand triggers, that's sort of what it's like. And so, how do you defeat these triggers? You do it with time and a very, very deliberate approach. If you deliberately trigger someone, you're a flaming asshole. Because triggering someone in an uncontrolled environment just re-traumatizes them. It doesn't allow the person to give themselves that self-talk. This isn't happening anymore. I am safe. I am in control. We are good. I am in the present. There is a cat here. That's my personal thing. There's always a cat where I'm at. My BioShock Infinite monologue would be, there's always a cat. There's always the cat food. But over time, you kind of get good at the video game that is fighting your own trauma triggers. And if you've ever had a video game where at first you're like, oh my God, this is ridiculously hard. How does anybody beat this? And then you find the trick, like that, you know, how to defeat a Capcom boss, a classic Capcom boss. And all of a sudden the level is easy peasy. A lot of triggers are like that. You know, it's not something you have to slog through for the rest of your life. Eventually it just feels so natural to handle something differently, to think about it differently, to be able to look at a memory and go, that was something that happened, not something that's happening. It's very much like that. You do practice and you get good. And it's not just about a coping mechanism. A lot of people talk about coping mechanisms. You see, I'm not going to link to any websites on this because they talk about coping instead of recovery. I'll check the one site I'm at. I saw that I liked that called recovery. I'll have to make sure there's no issue with coping, because coping is not what you're striving for long term. If you are aiming just to cope, you will never beat the game. You are always going to be that person who has to be helped through on co-op because you can't, you know, you can't tank your way through. You've got to actually complete the level. You actually have to close that book. And the reason I'm talking about it this way is because, much like the way traditional talk therapies and companion animals and rapid eye movement and all that stuff don't work for veterans, because their paradigms are completely different. I don't think they work for gamers the same well, because they're so touchy-feely, associated with like coloring books and body pillows, this self-soothing stuff that we just don't go for. We're tough. Like I said before, we have this view on the world that is get good. And so what's going to work for a gamer and what worked for me is the idea of get good. You can beat this because this is a game designed for you to win. And if you have any trauma-related issues. Repeat that to yourself every time you start feeling that way, because that sense of helplessness is keeping you stuck. This is a game designed for you to win. And I'm sure we've all been there in a game that's really hard, Battletoads, Ninja Gaiden, and you're like, this is impossible. No, it's not designed to be impossible. It's designed to be very, 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 very difficult. But it is a game designed for you to win. Ultimately, you're supposed to be able to beat it if you work hard enough. And that is the thing we get out of games that we do not get in life. And the idea, the great thing about trauma therapy is this is exactly like a video game. This is a game designed for you to win. You can come out the other side. And then there's another game. And then there's another game. And then there's another game. But we don't get bored that way, right? And so you will eventually work through and you will eventually find something that works. As long as you're willing to take the time and do the work and address those trauma triggers in controlled environments. And what you have to get very, very good at, and I know you gamers because I am one of you, is recognizing the limits of how much you can deal. If you just re-traumatize yourself, it's gonna set you back, right? It's just like using all your high-powered ammo to defeat the little enemies and then you've got nothing left for the boss fight at the end of the level. You don't want to do that. You want to use the weakest weapon you possibly can to get through. Save, hoard that extra ammo for the final fight. And it's the same way. Don't go too far too fast because you will get a setback. Don't run before you walk. Every day that's better is a better day. And practice. But that involves planning. You may, the minute you start feeling the least bit good, want to do all the things. I know I did that. I've seen friends that also have PTSD do the exact same thing. And I have to be the jerk right then and do the sort of nah. And they don't always like me much in that moment, but I've been there and I've come out the other side. And you are not being a hero by charging into battle and Leroy Jenkins the shit out of it, because we all know what happened when Leroy Jenkins did his thing. He's famous, but they lost the fight, right? Everybody got slaughtered. And so you have to plan. If you're gonna have a big event that you know is gonna be tough, whether it's crowds or whether it's a Christmas party, I had issues with those. Still don't like them, but not liking them is not being triggered. It's not liking it. And I know I can grit my teeth and get through it, but I always kind of make sure if I have to go to one of those kind of loud, boozy Christmas parties that I try not to do anything or have a very light day the next day, because I'm going to be bone-achingly body tired. And you may feel weak because of that, but it's not. It's the same way you have to reload after a map in a shooter. You know, you hear that bang at the end of like a Gears of War fight, which lets you know you cleared the map, all the enemies are gone. And then you go around hunting for ammo while they do the quippy thing. You need those down periods. It is not weakness, it is reloading. So those are a lot of things you can tell yourself as a gamer dealing with trauma and PTSD. First is, this is a game designed for you to win. Tell yourself that over and over and over again. I'm repeating it a lot so it sinks in. The next one is take time to reload. Reloading is important. Reloading is smart. Next is remember that games tend to be sequels, so you lick one set of triggers, you do that Ares fight. There's gonna be God of War 2. It's part of it. Successful franchises get sequels. But also, get good. Your mantra in dealing with triggers is the same as getting better at a game. Practice, go at your own pace, you will get it. So, let me know what you think. Hopefully that was helpful. Like I said, no mamby-pamby hug it out bullshit. This is real talk. This is gamer talk. Hope it helped. This is an experiment, and hope you enjoyed my little RimWorld sojourn as well. I love this game.